Hello everyone and welcome to this new tutorial series about Scatter 5. I'm your host, Doran B, also known online as BD3D, and the lead developer and founder of the Scatter project for Blender that we started almost 3 years ago. If you are new here, greetings! Here's what you need to know about the project. Our goal is to create the perfect scattering toolset for Blender professionals. We propose top-of-the-line features displayed in a well-designed interface and very polished workflow. In short, the Scatter 5 plugin is boosting the productivity of pros around the world by saving them a lot of time and effort. So let's jump in. We are going to kickstart this tutorial series with an ArcViz. This tutorial will be separated in 2 parts. In the first part, we will discover how I created this scene using the Scatter 5 plugin and Blender. And in the second part, we will talk about rendering, lighting, and the post-processing. So first thing first, let's start with the terrains. Here we have 2 distinct terrain objects, one emitter used for the foreground and one for the background. The 2 of them have the scale applied. This is very important to do this in Blender. You want to make sure you are working with the correct local scale. You can apply the scale in Blender with a Ctrl-A menu, and remember, in the Properties panel, you can also check if the object scale is set to 1:1:1 ratio. In terms of topology, our terrain is quite densely populated with vertices. This is important for vertex group, because remember, when we paint vertex group in Blender, you need some vertices. And also, the terrain material are quite simple. We don't want to have much complex material for the terrain here because everything will be covered in vegetation anyway. Now for the most important part of our scene, we need an architecture. And why not a multi-million villa? Of course, why not? We can dream, right? So you can start to spend a lot of time designing and modeling your own building if you'd like. However, this is quite out of the context of this video. We are ArcViz artists. Our role is to make the design of someone else very appealing. For this, I recommend to use existing designs that can be found online, and I have a great resource for this. It's called the 3D Warehouse, also known as the SketchUp Warehouse. They have a ton of building available in there. It's crazy. You have some Zaha Hadid, some Mies van der Rohe, some Frank Lloyd Wright, Tadeo Ando. You will find your happiness there. No worries. However, be aware that SketchUp is a double-edged sword. Most things going out of this market have an horrible topology. You will have some cleanup to do. That's because, if you don't know, SketchUp is a really easy to pick up polygonal modeling tool for students and architects. And they are lacking some serious functionalities. For example, there's not the notion of vertices. So I will work with this house. It's called Casa Proyecto MC by Luis, but feel free to use your own model you found online. The first thing you will need to do is download this file as a Collada collaborative file and import the Collada file inside of Blender. This will import a lot of new objects inside of your scene. I'd suggest to rescale directly if the scale is wrong and link them in a new collection. You will then be able to remove any objects you don't want to see. And then I'd suggest to Ctrl-G to merge every part of the architecture together. This will be much more easy down the line for doing the cleanup. About the cleanup, the most important part is avoiding any geometry overlap. This can be done with the merge by distance operator. You want to be careful with the distance value of this operator because it might delete important details of your geometry. After that, we can recalculate the face's normal from the outside. If you don't know, you can visualize the face's orientation in the Viewport Overlay subpanel. Optionally, you can apply a limited dissolve operator. Because this is an architecture, we are using flat shading. There's no problem with handguns here. Now for the materials. Well, creating a new material in Blender is quite easy. You just need to connect the PBR texture to the PBR shader. The trickiest part will be the projection, because your architecture most of the time will have very bad UVs, sometimes no UVs at all. Of course, you can do an automatic UV unpack and spend time unwrapping your UVs yourself if you'd like. That's possible. I advise you to do this instead. Use tree-planar projection mapping when you can. This will save you a lot of time in the long run, and this is a semi-procedural way to conceive your architectural materials. You can do that by using the geometry position vector input, changing your image texture projection to box, and rescaling the size of your mapping. And just like that, this material will adapt dynamically to any architectural geometry. One last thing regarding the materials will be the glass shader. To create a glass shader in Blender, you just use the principled BSDF node, put the color to white, the roughness to 0, and the transmission to 1. As always with glass, be careful that your glass object is an actual volume with correct normals. If you are using a simple plane, for example, it will create refraction errors. Or you can cheat your way in and use a shiny metallic material with an alpha set to like 0.2 to only catch the reflection of the glass. And that's it, we are done with our architecture. Let's do the next steps now. To add more depth to our render, we will add a new cylinder object, rescale it so it fits the whole content of the scene, change the display option to wire, and apply a new volumetric material. We can adjust the density of this volumetric material, or we can also use a noise texture in combination with the bright contrast node and the multiply node to adjust the density of this texture. However, in this scene, I will keep it simple and only use some flat density. For the lighting and atmosphere, I recommend two very important plugins in my opinion. The first one is called Gaffer. It's made by Zaal. He's the founder of Polyhaven. You will have access within the plugin of every HDRI of Polyhaven for free. And it's a handy tool to iterate over multiple HDRI within just a few clicks. The second plugin is called Physical Starlight and Atmosphere by the guys at Physical Add-ons. Like Scatter 5, it's a tool made by professionals for professionals. This add-on is very useful if you'd like to create procedural skies, lighting, and atmosphere. I cannot recommend these two plugins enough. You can find them online on the Blender market. I will put the link in the description below. Now let's organize a bit our scene. So in the outliner, we can see that I created 5 collections. A tech collection that will contain all the camera objects, the lighting objects, the volumetric objects, an architecture collection, a terrain collection containing our 2 emitters, a plugins collection. It's always useful to have because some plugin like Scatter 5 will create collection in your outliner, and a vegetation collection that will contain all the objects that we will scatter. Now everything is ready for us and we can start the scattering with the Scatter 5 plugin. Our 2 terrains are waiting for us and we will scatter the items contained in the asset browser library. Remember, in Blender 3.0 we have a shiny new asset browser library editor. It's a fantastic new functionality that allows us to create our own custom-made library. It can be done by going in the Preferences editor. You can choose your asset library blend file, and within this blend file you can mark objects or materials as an asset. Here we will use the starter library, the library shipped with Scatter 5. It contains 180 assets, but you are of course free to use your own assets if you'd like. Before doing any scattering, I will quickly overview the various scatter layers I created in this scene. So first, I have a grass layer combined with some dead leaves and some clovers. We can see that there is a texture influencing the density of these 2 layers. These lower vegetation layers are avoiding to be near a rock layer. And of course, I added some gravels near the rocks. Then we have a scatter layer dedicated solely to distribute this pine tree. Then finally, for this emitter, we have a tree line separating the foreground from the background. And for the emitter in the background, well, we have a forest made of 3 different layers of various tree species. And let's start to scatter our first layer of grass. In order to scatter anything in scatter 5, you need to first choose your emitter. When it's done, you can of course change your emitter by clicking on the button in the header of each panel. To scatter something, you go in the creation panel, where you will use most of the time the scatter by preset operator. It's very easy. You just choose a preset you want to scatter with. You can optionally change the name and the color of this preset. It will be applied to the system list later. Then you select the object you want to scatter. If this object is located in the viewport, you set the selection option to viewport. And if it's from the asset browser, you set the selection option to asset browser. Then you just have to click on scatter and you will have a new layer appearing in your system list. If a message pops up during the scattering operation, no worries, it's completely normal. You're probably using a very large terrain. If you don't know, when you try to display a lot of triangles in a rasterized viewport, your graphic card will have a hard time to compute. Of course, Cat5 comes with a lot of display and visibility optimization to overcome this limitation. But for now, in this tutorial, I'd suggest to work with a smaller terrain, especially if it's your first time trying out the plugin. So we have our grass layer. We can of course change the density of the distributed points in the distribution sub-panel. And if we'd like to change the instance posteriori, well, we can do this in the instancing list. Note here that we are working with clumps model. Clumps model are made out of tinier parts merged together to form one larger entity. Clumps models are essential when you are trying to create an environmental scene, because you cannot simply scatter a huge grassland with individual grass blade. You're going to have a hard time. So it's much easier for such situation to use model made in clump. Of course, the scale of the clumps depends on the scale of your shot. If you are trying to do a close-up shot, for example, then it will be best to use individual grass blade or very tiny clump models. Now I will also use the scatter preset operator to scatter all dead leaves. Instead of choosing a blue preset, we will choose a red preset this time. We can of course change the color and the name of the system created in the system list. The colors of these systems can be accurately represented within the viewport if we go in this option menu and click on this button right here. By default, the leaves will spawn below all grass, so we will use the push along feature of Scat5 to resolve this problem. The red presets will have a procedural texture influencing the density and scale of the scattered items. We can go in the pattern sub-panel to toggle on or off the pattern slots we have. We can choose a more accurate name for this texture data. And if you click on the settings option of the texture data, we will see a new pop-up with every procedural settings and options. There is a very useful functionality to visualize this texture data as a vertex color layer in our emitter terrain. We can then, for example, change the transforms of this texture, change the scale, the brightness of this texture data. Now I need a layer with some clovers. Well, instead of creating a new scatter, I will copy and paste the existing dead leaves layer, change the name and the color, then change few settings, for example, the seed value of the distribution, and most importantly, in the pattern sub-panel, I will make sure that this texture data is unique to the clovers, because in Scatter 5, a texture data can have multiple scatter system users at the same time. Then I will randomize the location of this texture data, and finally replace the dead leaves model by our clover model. So for now, we have 3 different lower vegetation layers. And some of the instances contained in these layers are not even visible in our final shot. And for this precise reason, we at the Scatter team developed over the years some visibility, camera optimization and clipping solutions. Because here we have 3 layers, we will make sure that the 3 layers are selected in the system list and keep pressing the Alt key while clicking on the toggle button. Why, you may ask? Well, because in Blender, the Alt key is used to batch change properties of the selected objects. This is a universal rule that we also incorporated within the Scatter 5 plugin. We will batch change the FOV values and enable our culling feature that way. There is another important feature that the Scatter team tried to innovate and develop over the years. It's the display as feature. We named this functionality LOD and proxy in previous version. Well, the goal of this feature is to display a very easy to rasterize object for the viewport, and during the rendering, it will switch to the full resolution object. For all lower vegetation layers, I will batch enable the display as feature, change the drop down to single points, and adjust the scale of the points. Points such as these are extremely performant to display, meaning that you can display millions and millions of them without a slowdown. Next, I will scatter a new layer of rocks, and with the help of a vertex group, I will remove the density so it's only appearing in the lower left corner of the shot. But this is not quite perfect because we want to avoid having some lower vegetation near our rocks. Perhaps it's best to have some gravel layers near our rocks. To do so, Scatter 5 has the exact feature you need. It's called the ecosystem feature. It's a way to create repulsions or affinities in between systems dynamically. Let's do this then. We are going to select all lower vegetation layers, batch enable the repulsion feature, batch assign the pointer to the rock layer. Then we will batch change the distance to fit our need. Now we can do the opposite with the new gravel scatter layer. We will enable the affinity feature, assign all pointers to the rock layer and adjust the distance slider. The great thing about this ecosystem feature is that it's completely procedural. Once all the rules are set up and the scatter layer depends on each other, you can change the seed of, for example, a tree, and it will drastically change the whole environment of your scene. For the forest separating our background from the foreground, we will directly drop a few tree models inside the viewport directly from our asset browser in order to scatter them from the viewport. And we can see that these trees are displayed as a wide bounding box. You should know this normally. This is a native feature of Blender, can be found in the Properties Object Display panel. We could scatter this tree with a forest preset. However, I will take the alternative route here and click on the plus button of my system list. This will add a virgin scatter system with our trees defined as instances. From here, we are able to quickly change few settings such as the distribution density, the default scale and the random scale, randomize the tangent alignment of our tree, and choose to display our trees as a placeholder object. We could also use a vertex group in order to paint our forest area. However, there are many ways to cause distributed points in Scatter 5, and for the sake of diversity, I will use a closed Bezier area to define the distribution zone. One last thing for this emitter, I'd like to precisely define where my sapling tree instances will appear in this terrain. And to do this, we have a brand new exclusive feature. It's called the manual distribution mode. This mode, exclusive to Scatter 5, really deserves its own video. It's really good. It's a mode that enables us to paint instances like we would on a painting with different tool sets and brushes. So we will add a new virgin system, add the pine instances in the instancing collection, and disable the display as feature. Then you simply change the distribution mode to manual, and you will have access to a brand new world where an assortment of various brushes are at your disposal. For now, we will only use the dot brush. With this brush, you can click to spawn new instances where you want them to be. And then finally, for the forest in the background, we will use a much faster method, which is the biome system. First, let's swap emitters. Then you can open your biome manager either in the creation panel or in the add-on preferences. Then please enable the option that will display the placeholder by default upon creation. Then you just have to choose your forest biome and the work will be done automatically for you. Very handy, right? This fantastic biome system for Blender that we invented 3 years ago with the first release of the Scatter plugin really deserves its own video. So please don't hesitate to subscribe to hear more about it. Note that the Scatter 5 plugin is shipped with a library of more than 80 biomes. It comes with the plugin. And that's it, folks. Our scene is done. It's looking very good. However, we didn't do the rendering, neither the post-process yet. This is coming in the part 2 of this video. If you are interested in the Scatter 5 product, don't hesitate to check out our blendermarket page. And we also have a very well done documentation website. I will put the link in the description below. As always, subscribe to this YouTube channel if you want to hear more. You can also follow me on social media. You can interact with Scatter 5 community on Discord and on Blender Artists. That's it, folks. See you soon.